might mainly be really interested in trees, but views like this also really get me. I love getting out to take a look at all this rock here. I'm near Olmsted Point in Yosemite National Park, kind of a must stop along the Tioga Pass Road. And a lot of people actually do stop out here, but most of them are enjoying these sweeping views of granite that we're looking at here, this glacially carved landscape. And a lot of those people who get out of their cars to snap a photo of this, they don't realize that right behind them, right around them, all over this landscape are beings that have been here sometimes for thousands of years. Today, we're going to be looking at a really special type of tree that's one of the oldest trees that grows here in the Sierra Nevada mountains. We'll be learning about how it can survive on this somewhat harsh landscape of rock that I'm sitting on, and we'll be learning how to identify that tree and why it's so special to us as people. Let's get out there and take a look at our special tree for today. Today we're going to be looking at my friend, the Sierra Juniper tree. Now before we get out there and learn about the story of this tree and where to find it and all that fun jazz, you need to know how to identify it if you come across it. The first thing you need to know is that when you're looking for a Sierra Juniper, you're not looking for a beautiful straight trunked tree like you might see in a lot of pine trees, for example, around here. You're looking for something that looks a little bit tortured. And we'll get into why these trees are so contorted later on in this video. But for now, assume that a lot of these trees are going to look like giant versions of Japanese bonsai, twisted, gnarled, bent in every direction. And that's what you're looking for in the general form. Aside from that, another really distinctive feature of this tree is going to be the bright orange bark that you'll find on there. And that bark isn't going to be like a lot of other conifers in this area. It's going to be very fibrous, very soft if you put your hand on it, as opposed to woody like you might find on many of the pine trees around here. If that orange bark peels away, as it very often does on these old trees, you'll see gray wood underneath. And other features of this tree that you'll be watching for is a very dense foliage, meaning you're not going to see many gaps where there are actually leaves. They're going to be filling in as much empty space as possible. And those leaves are going to be in what we call an overlapping pattern. And that means that each leaf is going to be overlapped by the one behind it. And it's going to create kind of this tube of leaves heading out in a dense bundle in a rounded shape on these trees. Now, a final feature of the junipers to watch for, and this is another distinctive feature, are what we call juniper berries. And these berries are actually cones, but unlike a lot of other cones that you might expect from trees like this, these ones are going to be kind of a bluish color, and they're not going to be woody, they're going to be wrapped in kind of this fleshy layer. And the color that you see on those cones is oftentimes not actually their true color. If you rub them, you'll notice that a whitish layer disappears, and that whitish layer is actually a type of yeast that grows on the outside of these berries or cones. So now that you know how to identify these Sierra juniper trees, let's learn a little bit about their lifestyles. Now that we know how to identify a Sierra juniper, let's talk a little bit about the struggles this tree faces. Take a look at the Sierra juniper behind me right here, and you will notice that it's in a natural bonsai form. This tree is gnarled. It's wrapping itself around the rocks. Its branches have been knocked over. It has huge amounts of dead wood compared to the tiny little bit of actual living growth behind me right here. And this tree could be hundreds, if not thousands of years old here. Why does it look this way? You know, aside from being that old, I would probably look that way too if I were that old. Well, these trees grow in a pretty harsh environment. It's fine for us to stop for a day and take a look at this beautiful landscape here, but imagine trying to live here and get every single thing that you need to survive from this exposed rock face without even much soil here. These trees have to face that. From the day that they land as a tiny little seed, their growing life might be as small as a couple-inch crack in the rock here. And all of the nutrients that they need in life are in just a tiny little band of soil in there. And they've got it harsh from the beginning. But not only that, the climate here makes it a little bit difficult too. In the summertime, the sun beats down like it is today, giving me a sunburn, but making it hard for these trees to avoid that same kind of sunburn. And in addition to that, it dries out this landscape very quickly here because there's not much rain here in the summer months. In the wintertime, they have the opposite problem. Temperatures can get below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. You can have winds ripping up these canyons here with no protection from other trees. And you can have up to 9 feet of snow here. And sometimes, with these exposed rock faces, that turns into avalanches. So first we need to question, how do the trees survive this? And then we need to ask, why? Why on earth would a tree try to grow here when there's lots of deeper soils around here that they could make a forest in? Well, let's get to the how first, and then we'll get to the why in just a moment. So what, aside from a great advanced age, is making these trees so gnarly? Well, a lot of that's going to have to do with the winter snows and the wind here. Trees like the one in front of me here that have been completely knocked over repeatedly by the crushing weight of that winter snow, or by heavy gusts of blowing wind having their branches broken, snapped, bent, are probably going to end up permanently in this kind of Krummholz or twisted wood form that we'll find out here on these exposed rock faces. The lack of available water and nutrients kind of makes it hard for them to repair that damage from that just getting tossed around by the elements, and so they might not ever regain a fully upright form once they've been crushed down in that way. Now, there are some trees that do get to an upright form, but even they feel the extremes of this environment. Behind me right here is a juniper, which is growing in an upright tree form, and yet a lot of its wood is dead. Now, what's happening here is that this juniper tree, even though it has obtained that upright form and not been knocked over by the wind or the snow, if there's any kind of thing that does damage it, rip off a branch, expose the dead inner wood, it probably isn't going to have the nutrients to recover that. And so it's not uncommon, especially on really old trees, to have these monster trees where most of the trunk is actually dead, and they'll just have a couple of live branches continuing on the legacy of this ancient wood. Are there ways to survive in this harsh climate? Obviously, because the Sierra juniper is doing it, right? But how is it doing it? How is it going against all of these elements of nature and the drought and the sunlight and everything to survive here? Well, this tree has a strategy, and that is taking it slow. There's some trees out there that live on a human lifetime. Trees like the alder, for example, often don't live much longer than 80 years. They grow quickly, they invest a lot in producing tons of offspring, and then they die. Trees like the juniper, they don't have that advantage. Remember, some of these trees are starting off their lives in just a couple inch crack in the rock with just a tiny bit of soil, not much nutrients. They can't afford to grow fast. There just isn't enough resource out there for that. So these trees have had to evolve to be able to have these incredibly long lifespans. And that's one of the coolest things about the Sierra juniper, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, millions of people every year come to this park, and a whole lot of them stop up there at Olmsted Point, where I parked my car today. And most of those people are enjoying the view, but the overwhelming majority don't realize that the trees growing around them right there are incredibly ancient beings. The thing with junipers here in the Sierra Nevada is that these trees quite often live to be over 1,000 years old, sometimes over 2,000 years old, and in a couple cases, there are Sierra junipers that are known to be over 3,000 years old. Those are beings that started their lives before the Roman Empire was formed, before the overwhelming majority of written human history even existed yet. These trees have sat here watching this place for thousands of years, and hopefully can continue to do so for thousands of years more, and we get to be a part of that when we come and enjoy them, make sure that we're protecting them so that they can live on that incredible lifespan that not many beings on this planet get to experience. Let's go out, and we're going to take a look now at a little bit more about the Sierra juniper on the landscape and why it would grow in this particularly harsh area of rocks instead of down in the more fertile bottomlands where there's a little bit more soil, water, and nutrients. So with the difficulties of growing in this harsh rocky climate with snows and sunlight and summer droughts, why would these trees like to grow here in the first place? Well, that's a really good question, right? Why couldn't these trees grow elsewhere? Well, the thing is that nature isn't about picking the easiest place to grow. It's about a balance of the good and the bad to allow an organism to perpetuate itself forever and trade off things in such a way that it survives enough to pass on its genes to the next generation, and that it doesn't become so prolific that it just uses up all of the resources. Now, with the case of the Sierra juniper here, there are actually some really big advantages in those trade-offs to living on these rocky faces. First things first is there's a lot of sunlight up here. I mentioned it in the context of being something kind of harsh because being out in the sunlight can be kind of damaging. Anybody who's been out here in Yosemite like me without sunscreen knows that. But in the case of these trees here, they have this waxy layer that I briefly mentioned when we were talking about identification on their leaves. It's called a cuticle. And that waxy cuticle protects the leaves from the sunlight and allows them to grow in these high sunlight areas, which, if you're a tree, is a really big benefit because sunlight is how you make your energy. And so the juniper, with that protection on their leaves, is able to grow in the sunny spot without having to worry about competing in the shade of other trees. And as a sun lover, it really enjoys that. But there's another feature that is even more important for these trees, especially in the context of them being in the cypress family. A lot of members of the cypress family aren't super good at surviving fire. And there's a couple of exceptions to that. The sequoias, for example, really great at surviving fire. But the junipers here are not one of them. When a fire comes along, often it burns through that thin orange fibrous bark and will kill the tree outright. So in that case, with California being such a fire-driven place, how can these trees possibly survive to be thousands of years old? Well, the answer is they grow out on these exposed rocky faces. See, there isn't much vegetation around here to burn other than juniper trees, which means when a fire's coming along, it runs up against the edge of these rocks and can't continue up onto the rocks. And we're going to show you this in a quick little experiment right here. Hi everybody, Theo the Tree Guy here with a science experiment for at home. Kids, remember to ask your parents' permission before conducting experiments with fire. Today, we're going to be testing the hypothesis that rocks are not flammable. The equipment that we have here today is a standard cigarette lighter and a rock. And we're going to be looking at this. We're going to light our lighter here and hold it up to the rock. And look at that, the rock is not flammable. This helps us to prove that the Sierra juniper tree can live on rocks without easily catching fire because rocks are not flammable. Thank you and tune in for the next experiment that we conduct here on Tree Talks with Theo Haas. Now that we know a little bit more about the Sierra juniper as it relates to fire, we can actually tell things about the forest based on how they're growing. And we know that these trees generally prefer to live out on big open rocky faces, or at least get to their oldest and greatest sizes out there. And that's because fire doesn't burn on rock. We proved this with an experiment. But every now and again, we're going to find Sierra junipers growing in amongst the forest, kind of like this little grove of them behind me here. And this actually allows us to make an assumption about the forest around us here. And because we know that these trees often die when a fire comes through, we can make an educated guess that this type of forest around me here doesn't see that much fire, because if it did, then we wouldn't be able to see junipers like this in this patch of forest. So right now I'm standing up a little bit higher elevation than where I was filming earlier today, about 8,600 feet, and around me is mostly a lodgepole pine forest. And here in the high part of the Sierra Nevada, these lodgepole pine forests aren't really super adapted to a fire coming through every couple of decades or even centuries. These trees need to live out their lives without fire for a long time. And so it's fortunate for both the lodgepoles and the Sierra junipers here that we are high enough in elevation that generally temperatures here stay cool throughout the summer, and a very large winter snowpack means that the soils stay generally moist for a good portion of the year, meaning that fires are fairly rare up here, and we can find Sierra junipers growing in the forest rather than out on exposed rock faces. So are there human connections to the Sierra juniper? You'd better believe it, because just as these trees can live for thousands of years, human beings have lived in the area that is today Yosemite National Park for thousands of years as well. The 7 tribes associated with Yosemite as their traditional homelands have a traditional use for this tree as something that they can use the resin of to coat arrow shafts in a way that preserves them. And that preservation is one of the reasons that this tree is medicinally important, because if you're going to live for thousands of years, you need to have chemical compounds that fight off pathogens. And as a result of that, juniper can be used as a medicine to fight off human ailments as well. In particular, it's been used historically as something that can be used to fight off urinary tract infections. There's also traditional use of this tree as a contraceptive using the berries. Now, of course, if you're ever using a tree in a traditional medicine sense, it's really important to study up and make sure that you have years of practice before you try to use it, so that you make sure that you're safe and that you're harvesting properly, because remember, we don't want to hurt a tree that has such a long lifespan and really depends on that to reproduce. Now, another commonly known use for juniper trees comes from Europe. In France, this tree is used as the basis for creating gin. The berries, fermented, can create that popular drink. Now you know a little bit about your connection personally as a human being to this tree that can provide us with some medicinal value in addition to being very cool. Just a quick note on protecting these trees here and making sure that they can live out to their maximum potential without us as human beings hurting them. I've mentioned earlier that this bark here is very fibrous and soft, and one of the things we can do to protect them is make sure that we're never ripping that bark off the tree or even getting up too close and hugging them. Because in cases like this in Yosemite National Park, where thousands of visitors a day might pass by these trees, if every one of those people hugs this tree, within a couple years, that thin bark could get rubbed right off. So appreciating these trees from a no-touching distance is a great way to enjoy them. The next time you're out in the forests of the Sierra Nevada mountains, take a look around and see if you can spot a Sierra juniper tree, and remember how this tree connects you with the rest of the natural world. Hi everybody, I hope you enjoyed this last tree video. If you want to learn a lot more about trees, you can keep up with this page by subscribing to it. And if you want to help it grow a little bit more, please consider sharing these videos out to more friends.